Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of the Wellsy Weekly Podcast. My name's John, aka Wellsy, and today is episode 44 of this wonderful, glorious podcast I do. How are you all doing? I hope you're well. I feel like I ask that every week, but I'm just nosy really. I want to, make sure everybody's doing alright, with the lockdown and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully it gets lifted within the next few weeks, which I can't wait for because I've got a lot of people I want to go meet, alright? But lockdown isn't all bad news. I've just had a lot of time to just sit down and relax, watch a couple of shows, catch up on some TV, even rewatch a couple of old shows that I used to watch. So, it's no secret that I'm actually a massive nerd, right? I don't think it's a secret to anyone. And you can tell because recently I've been watching, or rewatching rather, the 90s Xmen cartoon series, and it's really good. It's really cheesy, and it's just something I always like watching. If I've got nothing else to watch on TV, I'll just pop that on, and it's good fun, and it's not too long, so I don't have to pay too much attention. But whilst I was watching the show the other day, I had a bit of a thought, you see. So the MCU, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the whole Marvel movie franchise, it's very good, very popular. They've recently acquired the rights to X-Men characters, and for the most part the Fox X-Men movies, they were hit and miss. Some of them were good, some of them not so good, and now they are being introduced into the MCU, so they're going to be playing with all the characters such as Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Scarlet Witch, all this kind of stuff, and it'll be good and it'll be really interesting to see. But my thought was, how are they going to look? How are they going to introduce them into the movies? Because, obviously they've already got a history within this universe itself. So how the hell do you explain lots and lots of more characters with more superpowers? How do you explain that when they've never shown up before? And I've got a couple of ideas, and a couple of ideas of how I want them to look as well. And that's what I want to talk about today. How are we going to see X-Men in the MCU? But before I get too nerdy and just nerd you all out, my question for you today is, what is your favourite X-Men character? Did you like Patrick Stewart's Professor X, or are you a massive fan of Wolverine? Let me know down below in the comments below. That'd be much appreciated. Whether you come from YouTube, Facebook or SoundCloud, all are welcome here. So, getting back into the idea of me watching cartoons, because I'm a massive child. Especially when it comes to superheroes and stuff, because superheroes are cool. And what I think I enjoy a lot about the X-Men cartoons from the 90s is the fact that it was all bright and very colourful. Like, really colourful. You all know you had all these weird and wonderful colours. They were vibrant, they were bright, and they were comic accurate as well, because in the comics they're meant to be wild and adventurous costumes and designs and stuff. And I just really want to see this when they bring the characters into the MCU. I feel like they do a pretty good job with this already, having the looks of Iron Man's costumes, Captain America's costumes. They're pretty comic accurate, but they've got their own style, and they've got these weird little textures and stuff onto the more fabricated costumes. But they work, they're quite practical, and I quite like the looks of them all. And I feel like the X-Men characters need this treatment as well. I would love to see the classic blue and yellow Wolverine costume, with the massive pointy ear things or eye things. I'm not really sure what they are, but they're massive and pointy, blue and yellow. I'd love to see that. Or maybe Rogue's green and white suit. I mean, I've got a bunch of other ideas I want to see from the comics and the cartoons, but I doubt they're ever going to do them. 90s had a massive obsession with mullets and massive hair, and I think that'd just be really cool looking. To see just I don't know, the Bishop character with his massive mullet just coming back and just kicking ass. That would be awesome to see. Or if they did any comic storylines where you have characters coming back from apocalyptic future, but everywhere in the future in the cartoons it's just proper cyberpunk and metallic, and it just looks really cool. I'd love to see that in the movies as well. Hopefully a variation or some kind of Easter egg for it would be perfectly fine for me. But if they did full-blown cyberpunk Storm with the mohawk, I think that would just be perfect. And I hope they keep the character and costume designs of all the Deadpool characters from the Deadpool movies, because he's coming over into the MCU as well. However, he is already established, and they're just literally bringing them characters over. And there's a bit of CGI within their costumes, but I think it works, especially for Deadpool's eyes, because he only wears a mask. So you need to have all them kinds of expressions shown easily. I think that's better done with CGI than just a mask. But I'm really quite excited to see what they do, or how they make the MCU X-Men characters look. I think it'll be quite easily done, and I think they'll do a good job of it. What I'm worried about, or just a little bit worried about, is how they're going to actually integrate these characters into the movies, because like I mentioned earlier, the MCU has already got an established history. But X-Men, they've been around the comics since, I think, the 60s or at least the 70s, so they've been around in the comic books world for a while. How the hell do you introduce all those characters, because there's a lot of X-Men characters, how the hell do you introduce them characters into a pre-existing world? Well, I've got a few ways of how they might do it, and starting with the idea of using the Eternals movies to explain the X gene. The X gene, for anybody who doesn't know, is basically the genetic mutation in humans that basically gives people the mutant gene. Now, I think the Eternals movie, I think they're going to go very comic book origin. So the Eternals were created by a group of beings called the Celestials. The Celestials have already been introduced in the MCU, or at least nodded to. But basically, Celestials, a bunch of big space robot looking things that basically went from planet to planet experimenting on the species of each planet. On Earth, they created 3 different groups. The first one being Eternals, basically perfect-like, godlike beings, or angelic-like beings. That's why they look all nice and pretty, and they're being cast by really good-looking people. Then you've got those Deviants, which are essentially monsters, or people that have been deformed a lot. And finally, you've got Homo superiors, better known as mutants. And they could explain all of that through the new Eternals movie. However, I think another good way they could introduce mutants into the MCU is by using the aftermath of all these different Infinity Gauntlet snaps. You see, when you snap, that's a lot of cosmic energy being used by the Infinity Stones, the Gauntlet, and anybody, in the near vicinity, or on the planet that all these snaps happened, which was Earth. A lot of cosmic energy could just be sifting through, human population and basically activating the mutant gene. I think if they explained this in the right way, this would be a perfectly viable way to introduce mutants, and why we haven't seen them before, because their powers have not manifested yet. But I also have another idea how we could introduce mutants into the MCU. See, mutants have been around since the ancient Egyptian times. I think the first one, it wasn't Apocalypse, there was a female before that, but I can't remember her name at the moment. But basically, mutants could have been around for a very long time, but they could have just been hidden, kind of like, Wakandans in Black Panther. But instead of being in Wakanda in Africa, they could have been hiding on a little island called Genosha. Now, in the comics, Genosha is basically a mutant haven for mutants of the world, led by the infamous villain Magneto. Now, they could obviously adapt this for the MCU so that, Professor X is in charge and he's just been running this island for a very long time. But now all of a sudden Magneto is like, no, we should be able to take over the world, and that kickstarts the Brotherhood of Mutants and a storyline in how all the X-Men basically get introduced into the MCU and start interacting with our heroes. I think these are all perfectly viable and reasonable ways to actually introduce X-Men into the movies, but whatever they do or decide, I feel like the producers, Kevin Feige, the big cheeses of the Marvel movies, they're just going to use whatever's the easiest and simplest way to introduce them, because you can't make it too complicated, otherwise the average viewer or the moviegoer is just going to get too confused, really. And these are family movies at the end of the day, so kids have got to understand them as well. So I feel like the easiest and the most, simplest option is probably the best way to go. But whatever they do, I'm sure they're going to do a good job. Now, finally, we cannot talk about bringing X-Men into the MCU without talking about what characters we really want to see. Now, I'm not actually going to go for any of the big hitters, purely because they will get introduced. They'll guarantee to get introduced. Characters like Professor X, Magneto, Wolverine, favourites, fan favourites that have already been seen dozens of times in dozens of different forms in the media. No, what I want to see is a bunch of smaller B-list and C-list characters, and you could use these as a way to introduce the bigger, more heavy-hitting characters, like the actual X-Men, Brotherhood of Mutants, the Phoenix Force, all that kind of stuff. And I feel like they'll do it how they introduced like Spider-Man and other kind of characters, where they were just like, oh yeah, we know a guy that can swing, and then they introduce him, in Civil War and do it that way. Now, one of the first characters I think would work very well in the MCU is Polaris. Or Polaris? I don't know how you pronounce her, but basically she's the daughter of Magneto. And I think she's either the sibling or the step-sibling of Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, which have already been introduced into the movies. So basically she could be set up in a storyline of searching for her dad, but she ends up bumping into Scarlet Witch. Then they find out they've got the same dad or something like that, and then they introduce Magneto that way. They could also introduce a Canadian team of mutants called Alpha Flight, which is basically a gateway to get Wolverine into the mix. They could have a story that follows the IGH, basically trying to replicate or make the super soldier serum, and they could incorporate that into the Falcon and Winter Soldier series. And then an off-brand of the IGH could be the Weapons X program, which created characters such as Deadpool and Wolverine. And the final character that I would quite like to see is Hope Summers. Now, Hope Summers is a future character, or a character from the future, and she is the daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey, or at least a clone of Jean Grey, as far as I remember. And she's basically a very powerful mutant. She could come back in time with Cable. I feel like that was already hinted at in the Deadpool 2 movie, but I feel like an adult version would be really cool to see. And she could be introduced in another time travelling event, kind of like Avengers 5 or 6, and the main villain could be Kang the Conqueror, where he goes into the future, tries to kill off a bunch of mutants or X-Men characters, but then a couple of the survivors come back into the past to try and stop Kang. Something along those lines. I don't know how it'd all work, but I think that'd be a really cool, interesting way to do it. Or maybe they're like coming back from the future to try and stop an Ultron takeover event, where Ultron's come back from the dead somehow. Maybe like Sentinels have restarted him somehow. The possibilities are endless really of how you could introduce, or what characters you could introduce into the MCU. But I hope they do a lot more B-list and C-list characters, just so we can get a bit of variety and just see all the different versions, because there is a lot of X-Men characters in the comics that I feel like haven't had justice on the big screen or TV screen, and I feel like they deserve it, So, that's enough geeking out for me for one day. Honestly, I could talk about this forever if I was allowed, but this podcast is very short, so I'm not gonna. So I'll remind you that the question for today is, who is your favourite X-Men character? Is it one of the A-list characters like the White Queen, or maybe you like, I don't know, one of the more lesser known characters like Leech or Toad, or I'm trying to think of somebody else, Forge, who's another good character, he was in the cartoons as well. If you want to share your thoughts and opinions, let me know down below in the comments. So until next week, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy a cuppa.